Well, hello and welcome to IPAC's panel discussion on American politics. I'm Alexandra Rahr, the Bissell Hay Lecturer in American Studies at the Munk School's Center for the Study of the United States, University of Toronto. I'll be the moderator for today's event, and we are very lucky to be hearing today from some insightful and accomplished panelists. We're joined for our conversation today by Jeremy Kinzen, former Canadian diplomat who served as both High Commissioner for the United Kingdom, as well as the Canadian Ambassador to the European Union. He's also a distinguished fellow of the Canadian International Council. Christopher Sands is the director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, as well as director of the Center for Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And Laurie Troutman is the director of the Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of them and with you. Since the immediate aftermath of the US election, which we're here to discuss, has been a moving target, I just want to let you know where things are as we're recording, so you know the context that we're responding to, which may have changed by the time you're watching our discussion. So at the point that we're gathered to talk together, the networks have projected that Joe Biden will be the next president and Kamala Harris will be the next vice president. Donald Trump has yet to concede. He insists he won the election and continues to make unfounded allegations of widespread voter fraud. We're here today to talk about the US election and the state of at least a couple of unions, that of the American Republic itself, of course, but also of Canada's relationship with our biggest trading partner and the global economic and cultural superpower that is our neighbor. We're going to consider the issues which shape that relationship, especially in the shadow of the recent, highly consequential and highly contested presidential election. We'll be discussing the coronavirus pandemic and disaster preparedness. We'll be talking about President Trump. We'll be talking about trade, the state of the border, and the rise of populism, as well as, we hope, other topics which catch the eye of our esteemed panelists. So I'm going to pose some questions, and after each one, give our panelists a chance to answer. We're going to leap in and start now. There's certainly more than enough to talk about. So, as you know, populism is on the rise across the globe. Anti-elite rhetoric was plentiful throughout the US presidential campaign. Populists encouraged public distrust of expertise and of institutions. We can think here, of course, of Trump's attack on the deep state as just one example of this ideology and this rhetoric. So I'm wondering what impact a populist mood, what impact a populist nation might have on the public service, what the challenges are of being a public servant in a populist moment. And a secondary question related to populism is, as Canadians living on the other side of the border in a nation that is increasingly populist, with a president who for the last 4 years gave the citizenry permission to act in openly divisive and even violent ways, what happens when Canada and the US begin to diverge profoundly in ways of political culture, as well simply of systems of belief? So we're going to start with Jeremy, then move to Christopher and to Laurie. Jeremy?
Thanks very much. Well, these are huge questions of culture, identity. They're sort of existential, I guess. If I could just redefine your terms a bit, there's nothing wrong with being a populist. I mean, anybody who's running for an election wants to be popular. That's just by definition. The problem has been the emergence of populism as a form of nativism, okay, that is accompanied by nativists' sort of tendency towards xenophobia, very highly nationalistic and somewhat aggressive attitudes toward outsiders, involving, of course, an anti-immigration kind of attitude. It also involves a distrust, inherent distrust of elites, of course, but that translates into a distrust of evidence-based policymaking and eventually to government itself. I mean, some people have described Donald Trump's accession to the presidency as really an outside hostile takeover of government. And to some extent, that's how he's governed. Now, in Canada, of course, we hold to evidence-based policymaking. We hold to transparency, not because we're virtuous, but because it's what the public requires and demands. We don't have alternative sources of news, alternative facts being promulgated. I wonder about the extent to which emulators in the world, and there are some, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Orban in Hungary, the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, are going to have the wind taken out of their sails by these events, this election? Or are they going to be encouraged by the way that Donald Trump is contesting the Democratic vote? Which is getting a lot of laughs in Beijing, of course, saying a lot of "I told you so" stuff about democracy. My feeling is that the Le Pens of the world, Mario Salvini of Italy, that they've been deflated recently. Are they going to be further deflated or not? And this depends to some extent, not just on what happens to Donald Trump's campaign to keep himself at least in the news, if not in office. It's going to depend on how effectively democracies themselves get a better act of confidence together, doing it together and succeeding individually. So we'll have to see. But, it is a time for perhaps a more humanistic, more generalized populism, a universal populism, I might say. Maybe that's a bridge too far, but ideally that is, and to fight global warming. Thanks.
Christopher, what do you think about this anti-institutional populism that has been so much a part of the Trump era? Keeping in mind Jeremy's really useful caveat here that populism isn't limited to the right or the left, right? It's a political strategy, a political rhetoric, and an ideology that's been used all across the spectrum. So what do you have on your mind about populism at the moment?
Well, a couple of things, and thanks very much for having me. So I think that so far, both you and Jeremy have maybe illustrated how much danger Canada may be in from populism, because you can't actually talk about what's happening without insulting people. And one of the problems in the United States that we had, and to be fair on both sides, was that coming out of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which had a very disparate impact on people who were in the working class versus people who were doing better. I live outside DC, and our zip codes were the best off zip codes for house values and incomes during that crisis. In fact, I think we had 9 of the 10 richest zip codes in the country. Wow. I think a lot of people came through that and felt that the leadership in the United States, both the public service, but also the political leadership, was indifferent to how things affected them, and felt that whereas normally you have politicians who at least kind of, to use the Bill Clinton phrase, feel your pain or connect with you, there was a feeling that, during the Obama administration, he was a very cool cat, very low-key, no drama Obama. But it meant that people didn't always feel that he was paying attention to the real problems that they had. Another challenge, of course, is that COVID replicates that times 10. If like you and I mean, if you talk for a living and write for a living, you can telecommute. It's very easy, but my auto mechanic probably can't. A lot of frontline workers in healthcare, they can't really telecommute. Grocery store, clerks or daycare workers, educators who have to be in the classroom with young children. And so I think there's a real sense there's a disparate risk in the current environment where many people feel they're taking risks every day and struggling, and some of them are unable to work. And so they're hoping that the CERB in Canada or paycheck protection will help them make it through what could be an indefinite period. We don't have an idea when the COVID pandemic will firmly end, and there's a lot of hope it'll be soon. So into this mix, I'd add one important thing about the United States. as you know, federally, we have a very thick layer of political appointees on top of the professional civil service, especially federally, but it happens in the states as well. And I think in that, because of that, people's impressions of government are more often those political appointees than the professionals. And this is something Canada's escaped because you have a professional civil service which is respected and has face time with the public. Obviously, politicians are there too, but you haven't had this feeling that whole heads of agencies, assistant secretaries in our terminology, or deputy assistant secretaries who are Senate confirmed, have very political attitudes, which can make you feel that they're not on your side. They're not on the side of the average person. So to the extent that Donald Trump has capitalized on that, he's been able to do sort of a version of what Bill Clinton did. He conveys that he has people's backs. And in this current environment, people have been drawn to him as a defender. And I think in this last election, it was close. And Democrats didn't perform that well. They underperformed in the House. They underperformed in the Senate. They were far below their own goals. They didn't turn, let's see, I think they gained no seats in the House. They lost some. They weren't able to turn a single incumbent Republican seat over. The only state legislature that changed hands was New Hampshire's, and it changed hands into Republican hands. It's the first time since 1932 that we've had so few state legislatures turn hands. And that matters because while your census is next year, our census is this year. And that census will drive redistricting, which is controlled by the states. So the Republicans have done very well. And although Vice President Biden seems to be on his way to election, it's going to be in a very divided Washington. And I think part of his success was that, unlike other Democrats, he was able to do a bit of what Trump did and make people feel that he cares about them. I think that's really the antidote. Elitism versus populism isn't the thing. It's a sense of evidence-based policymaking because becoming almost a dictatorship of experts that leaves people feeling that they're left out. And inclusion, diversity, all those things are important, but there are also a lot of people who have been alienated from their government. And this is one thing, just as a last comment, I think Canada has always done much better at. In some ways, Canada's been a more elitist country than the United States. A long time having sort of, whether it's the Chateau clique and the family compact all the way down, there's a sort of a sense that there's a national elite and there are provincial elites. And that's fine because you've also had a political culture based on peace, order, and good governance in which even well-to-do politicians, Justin Trudeau might be one, comes from a good family and all of that, they still see it as important for them to connect with the ordinary public. It isn't okay to be arrogant in Canadian politics. Happens sometimes, but there's a real pressure to try to relate to people. And I think that has kept that, plus a professional civil service, has saved you from having the extremes that you have in the United States. But given that we have Doug Ford in Ontario, we have François Legault in Quebec, who has a bit of that. We had Preston Manning in Alberta and then in national politics for a while. Populism does happen, even in British Columbia, the Van der Zalm phenomenon too. So it does happen in Canada, but so far it's never been quite so polarized and negative. And I think that's a great thing about the Canadian system. But where I'd start where I end, I think you have to be able to talk about what happens without leading with adjectives, because there are a lot of people who feel the arrogance when we call voters low information, racist, etc. And it's better to sort of take them as people who just want to have someone fighting for them in politics.
Yeah, I think that those points about populism being a kind of a response to, but also a register of inequity, right, and growing inequity. And also a form of articulating empathy, right? And how empathy has political weight, right? Empathy has political impact. And what does it mean to be able to articulate that in a way that does not repeat these categories of those of us who are on this side and those of you who are on the outside, the haves and the have-nots. Laurie, I know your expertise is border and cross-border work, and I'm wondering how ideas might cross borders as well as goods. Like, can we talk a little bit about how populism and how these kinds of ideologies or politics of resentment, are they portable? Do they cross borders just like goods and services?
Yeah, well, I would build a little bit on Chris's comment too, to recognize sort of the state of the US right now is largely a backlash to what's come before. And we swing back and forth, and we've swung really far, and we're gonna, keep swinging. So even though it feels like we're in a very extreme and perhaps unique situation right now, I think that we're gonna keep weathering these tides either way. And I'm not a political scientist, I'm a geographer. And so I tend to think about places and sort of place-based politics. And so when you're talking about, cross-border regions versus say the US and Canada, the politics are actually a little bit more in line than they would be if we just compare the federal to federal level. And here in the British Columbia, Washington state region, just to shift it a little bit, I mean, we have a governor and a premier that are very aligned and have a very good relationship, and that kind of political identity is shared. And so maybe that can be a bit of a sort of tear in the national perspective, and that there are sort of little cracks and levees where we can make those connections and connect across the border in terms of our politics. Maybe that's sort of limited to our environmental perspectives, which certainly between BC and Washington, we're very aligned. So I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, that's great to think about how this kind of politics can be so regional, right? And thinking beyond just that dichotomy of America versus Canada and the 49th parallel, that geographical way of thinking can help us see some of the nuances here, the ways in which there are connections across the border, as well as a simple divide between North and South. Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to our next question. As you know, epidemiologists have warned again and again that in our connected and mobile world, pandemics are global and not local problems. And this isn't just true of epidemics, but of other disasters as well, of fires and storms and floods and drought, which don't recognize national borders. We know that many Canadians live really close to the American border, and that many communities are in fact located right on that perimeter. So I'm wondering about the disasters yet to come, even as we're still living through this disaster of COVID-19. How can Canada prepare for the next disaster, whether that's a pandemic or a forest fire? And as the memory of COVID starts to fade, we're not always great at remembering, how can we make disaster readiness and a funding and a policy priority? And my last question about this is, how can Canada's disaster preparedness take into account the reality that America might be unprepared as our closest neighbor? And what about US-based disasters that just cross those borders freely and we can't just close our doors to keep out? So I'm wondering where we might be with disaster preparedness. And Christopher, I'm going to start with you and then go to Lori and then to Jeremy.
Sure. Broadly speaking, disaster preparedness is always plagued by fighting the last war. We sort of prepare for what we just saw, and then we get something that we didn't expect. Within the context of COVID, the previous pandemic that we faced was during the Obama administration. It was an avian flu, H1N2 or H2N1. I get all these numbers wrong, but this was something that started in Mexico and had caused a fairly significant death toll, despite the fact that it wasn't nearly as virulent as COVID. And what came out of that was a study process in which the Centers for Disease Control recommended stockpiling personal protective equipment and other things, with the idea that you never know what you're going to face, but you always could use some masks and vials for tests and so on. And those recommendations were received by the administration, reviewed by Congress, and we didn't do any of it. So we knew what we had to do and we didn't do it, so that we were caught flat-footed with this particular epidemic. And natural disasters are, to some extent, they're often like that. For a while, I was teaching at Western Washington, where Lori was, and we did a review that was part of the quadrennial Homeland Security Review, a process by which Homeland Security in the United States would look at our preparedness. And what we heard from people all over the Pacific Northwest was that they had received a lot of great equipment from DHS, whether it was hazmat suits and all kinds of gear in case of a chemical or biological attack, which after 9/11 was thought to be potentially something we should prepare for, only to have all the Best Buy dates go off on all the filters. The equipment hadn't really been much used, and the experts said, well, it could be used, but it's mostly useless now. And many of those agencies didn't have a budget to do upgrades. Like, they had received this as gift aid from the federal government or passed on, but then they didn't have the ability to maintain it because it wasn't built into their budget structure. So these kinds of things confound us. And one of the things that was interesting, I thought, about the COVID response was that the federal government in this case chose to try to let states manage their own processes. And in Canada, so much of what has mattered in COVID has been provincial. So education, public health, and even the decision to close businesses, all of that's been handled on a provincial basis. And with greater sort of comedy with Ottawa than you normally see, in part because Ottawa has been willing to write the checks necessary to give provincial governments the ability to back municipal and local governments to be able to respond. So far, so good. It's genuinely been very good. In the US, a slightly different form of federalism applies because many of these jurisdictions, many of the US states have their own revenue streams or a more significant control over their own revenue, and they don't rely quite so much on federal transfers. And so we've seen US states experiment. And some states, as you've seen on the news, have opened up early, only to regret it and claw back. Some of them have stayed closed, but with a significant economic cost on the back end. And we've seen people actually moving from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, in part because of, in response to the COVID restrictions, particularly people who are in a field that requires activity. So states that are allowing outside dining would get restaurateurs moving over just to try to keep themselves in business and vice versa. So in this situation, disaster relief, it almost depends on your philosophy. Canada generally better prepared and more collaborative. The US, we let 1,000 flowers bloom, and some of the states do well and some of the states do badly, and we can learn from that. But from outside, it looks like a very haphazard or chaotic situation. And going back to the reference to 9/11, what's interesting is most of these things are better if there is international cooperation. But international cooperation requires a constant amount of political negotiation. And as we found with so many things in globalization, it's easy for people to feel that it's us versus them. That's the dynamic that always kicks in. And if we're going to handle global challenges, we need to have a global we. And we don't really now. And nationalism has been the fallback for so many peoples in response to a sense of globalization that is indifferent to their well-being, whether you're the Greeks having trouble with your budget or you're the Brazilians having a COVID explosion. Like, who cares? And I say that because the IMF now reports that about 70% of their reserve capacity to help countries weather financial crises is now invested in Argentina, a country that's defaulted 9 times and probably is going to default again. When we come out of COVID, the US and Canada will be relatively well off, but there are a lot of developing countries that can be flat on their back, and they'll realize they have shortcomings in terms of transportation infrastructure, education infrastructure, and health infrastructure that they want to remedy, and yet their economies set back 10, 20 years in terms of development. So there's going to be a crisis coming, and countries like the US and Canada will have to be generous if we want to create a global we that we're all recovering together.
Oh, that's so interesting. And I really like your framing of this in terms of the sort of implementation. So what we can do pre-disaster and preparedness, but then the long aftermath of disaster that so often goes unnarrated, when the next crisis emerges. So that's such a useful framing. Laurie, I'm wondering about the regionalism of disasters, something like forest fires, right? Which cannot be defined simply as a national problem. Is that kind of geographical or regional thinking helpful to us in thinking about something like COVID-19 and other forms of catastrophe?
Yeah, thanks. COVID has been really hard because the scale of it is so impossible to capture, right? It's sort of everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And that's why I think part of the reason we've been so, not even necessarily misguided, just sort of at wit's end about what to do about something that really is very difficult, if not impossible, to control in some ways. And so I think with other natural disasters, like you said, there's often a regional nature to whether it's forest fires or even rising sea levels and climate change. And I think that does make it sort of less political or less politicized when you have these natural disasters, and B, a scale at which they can sort of be tackled in a collaborative way. And so I just give a couple examples out here. Chris had mentioned the subduction zone in Cascadia. There's been a lot of planning and prepared for a tsunami or an earthquake, given that we're in that zone. We see forest fire. We see our universities collaborating on urban smoke problems because they're the same problems, and they're, again, not like COVID. They're sort of easier to take the same approach because they're not politicized as much. I mean, certainly in the US, our forest fires have been politicized to a certain extent. We held a conference out here a couple of years ago where we brought together different sectors of agencies that were involved in cross-border collaboration. We looked at economics, and we looked at environmental issues, and we looked at transportation. And we had a keynote speaker who was from the Canadian Coast Guard, and he really hit home the collaborative nature and disaster resilience and relief between the US and Canadian Coast Guards out here. And a lot of that revolves around our orca whale populations and our salmon populations, which are a really critical component, not just of our environment out here, but also of our economy and our identity. And so that mechanism, I think, has really been leveraged to produce a really strong and really resilient collaboration in response to a natural disaster, which we could call our declining salmon populations a natural disaster, I think. And that's created not only sort of a depoliticized cross-border collaboration, but it's also one that's been well-funded and had continual leadership because it rests with the US and Canadian Coast Guards that have obviously very long-standing and very somewhat powerful relationships as well. So I think when we're dealing with things that are sort of experienced in a similar way on both sides of the border and have institutions that have been built up to be able to address them, then we can do them in a collaborative way and stand to benefit much more than, when we sort of approach things very differently, which we're seeing right now with COVID.
That's so interesting to think about the way in which one way to escape the partisan sort of blocks that get put on these kinds of responses is to think about the institutional relationships that are already in place regionally or cross-border through something like the Coast Guard, and how that can be used to depoliticize or at least to make less partisan kind of behavior that's necessary to get ready to address, all of the disasters you're pointing us towards. And I'm really glad you brought up climate change as sort of like the underlying disaster that's informing so much of what is going to shape our world and our politics. Jeremy, what are you thinking about disaster preparedness and about our shared long border in the era of COVID?
Well, disasters are disasters because they're disastrous, but also because they're symptomatic of something happened. I mean, they're an expression of problem. And the forest fires are happening primarily because of global warming. I mean, the intensity and abundance that they're occurring. I'm going to take issue not with what Chris said, but what I'm going to regret what he didn't say. Now, what he didn't say was that the United States has a president who is a climate change denier, is also a COVID denier in substance. And the difference between Canada and the United States was not because of the respective differences of the way we organize ourselves vis-a-vis the sub-federal components and this and that. It's that there was a consensus in Canada about the evidence of COVID, and there was leadership from the federal government. Everybody was on the same page as far as the severity of the affliction was concerned. Remedial practices, I mean, how we dealt with it and getting recovery eventually economically, there's going to be a lot of discussion, including about resources. But there was no discussion about the evidence. In the United States, there's a complete denial about the evidence. And it's complicated by American cultural issues. but don't tread on me, freedom, distrust of government. I was listening to the governor of South Dakota the other day. They're very, very serious cultural differences. And I don't think we're going to solve them, but I think that the countries which did extremely well in this, most of which were Asian, Taiwan, South Korea, of course, New Zealand, did so because they had a sense of communitarian solidarity. And they were willing to subordinate immediate individual inconveniences to the common good. I'm going to say that was even true of China, irrespective of the other aspects of China's responsibilities. And I mean, that's something we got to bear in mind. There are a couple of British guys, Nick Gowing of BBC and another fellow who've been running for a couple of years, a kind of a series going, and they've been coming to Canada talking to civil servants. Indeed, some people on this call may have seen Nick doing this, and their thing is called Thinking the Unthinkable. Okay, they're essentially black swan or disaster predictors without being specific, and their shtick is to try to enable organizations, institutions to organize themselves to anticipate what they can't anticipate, but they know that something is going to happen that they're going to have to be prepared for. And that's a state of mind. And the problem politically is the state of mind that exists, whether in the US Congress and often among politicians here too, is not on the long term. It's on the immediate forefront. With Donald Trump, it was about his re-electability. That was the prism through which he saw everything. If something was antithetical, was unfriendly to his re-electability, he simply denied it, and continues, by the way, to deny it. Joe Biden is basically the president-elect, and so that's turning out at least reassuring. In that Biden, of course, is an evidence-based person. Let me address a bit Lori's thing as the person across the San Juan de Fuca Strait from her, just to validate what she's saying about transborder connections among not just sub-federal forms of government. The British Columbia government is very close to the Jay Inslee government in the state of Washington, and to California and to Oregon. I mean, Cascadia does exist on a sort of a communitarian level, but let me say it's also true of civil society. We at least Western Washington State, we have a consensus view, I think, about a lot of policy issues, social issues, and Canada's strength, let me say, in terms of presenting its case for protecting our interests in the light of all these developments. Our strength is our representation in the United States, not just by our consulates, in state houses, governors, and public diplomacy. It's a representation in the United States by Canadians of Canada, including by scholars. I spent the last 10 years at University of California, and we ran a conference there at Berkeley, rather momentously called The Future of North America, which, by the way, stopped when Trump was elected, because we could see North America suddenly had a rather bleaker future as a sense of community. But right. But the point is that much of what we were talking about, the electricity grid, the whole energy environment swirl, okay, was transborder, but it was essentially regional, and it's very substantive, very concrete, and it may well have ultimately many of our solutions.
Well, I'd like us to talk about the border for a few minutes, but before we turn to that, Lori and Christopher, any follow-up, any trailing ends you'd like to mention on this topic before we move to another one? Yeah, Christopher?
Yeah, I think that Jeremy is onto something, and it's really an old debate within the West, if you can still talk about a West, and that is of the balance between individualism and a sense of community, or communitarianism. Sometimes it's said to be. It's a very old debate. It's one that has intersections with the Protestant Reformation and attitudes. The U.S. is perhaps among the more extremely individualist countries, and there are great things about that. We try not to put barriers before individuals who are trying to self-actualize or simply explore how they want to be called or how they want to interact with others, and we really do try to respect that. But what's missing often in the U.S. is that sense of community, and you can be living in close proximity to people and not necessarily know or be aware of them, even though you share physical space. It doesn't, this goes maybe to Lori's world of geography, you share a physical space, but you don't necessarily connect. I'll give you just a silly story. I live in Silver Spring, which is just outside the District of Columbia. District of Columbia begins about a mile from my house. In my neighborhood, because I teach at a university, I have all of these neighbors who see me walking the dog and want to know if I can hook them up with a college student, because they have a handful of kids from different houses in the neighborhood who are about the same age, and they're looking to hire a tutor because our school district is closed. It's all video classes, and we're a middle class neighborhood where parents have the means and they're going to hire a tutor and help make sure their kids get into a good school. A mile from here, the Washington Post did just a wrenching story about a single mom who is working in frontline healthcare, and she has to go to work every day. But her two kids are trying to go to school in the District of Columbia, where they're all online. And because cable television and broadband are not cheap in the United States, just as they're not cheap in Canada, her only option, they don't own a computer, was to leave her cell phone with her two kids so that they could do school without any babysitter or anybody around, so she could go to work, so she could put food on the table. And what she found after a shockingly short amount of time, and she gets her bill from the cell phone company, and data charges, especially when you're doing Zoom on your cell phone, are not cheap. And she just about had a heart attack. How was she going to pay this? And she had no other means. And what's the alternative? No education for her kids. The OECD, which Canada's a member of as well as the US, has a preliminary estimate that says for kids who are between kindergarten and the 12th grade in school now, they are estimating, I don't know how they come up with this number, a 3% lifetime drop in their earnings because of the setback of their education this year. And we have only just begun to realize just how the effects of this particular crisis are going to carry forward. And what Jeremy says about sort of a sense of community or empathy versus that sense of the rugged individual and self-definition, self-actualization is a really important balance. I don't think we have it quite right in the US. And you can see it in a crisis like this, which is putting those kinds of strains on all of us.
Yeah, that tension between individualism and, I say, communitarianism, or the collective and the individual states' rights versus federal rights, all of the different ways to articulate that is so much at the heart of the American project, the American experiment, and the question of where you hit that limit and what our obligations are to each other, and whether this is understood as a polarity, right? Whether it's me versus you, and it's seen as a zero-sum game. All of these ways of structuring individual progress and individual achievement really do have an enormous impact, and it's so visible in moments of disaster. Yeah. Well, let's talk for a little bit about the border. So we know, of course, that Canada shares the world's longest border between two nations with America, and that land border has been closed to non-essential travel since March. American travelers can still fly into Canada if they have a Canadian family member and they agree to quarantine for 14 days. Canadians can fly into the US with virtually no restrictions, although of course the Trudeau government has recommended that Canadians do not because of the risks of contracting and spreading COVID-19. We know that goods are still entering the country, but leisure travel by car getting in to drive to a family wedding or to gas up the car across the border or to go fly south for the summer, as so many snowbirds do, has largely halted in both directions. We know this kind of cross-border trade is worth billions of dollars. What happens if this closure continues for the foreseeable future, or if there's another pandemic? And is there a cultural as well as an economic impact here? What happens when we're facing an ongoing border closure of this kind? What kind of impact does this have? Lori, I'm going to start with you and then go to Jeremy and to Christopher.
Well, I'll make 2 points. One centered a little bit around identity to kind of draw on what was being talked about before, and the second a little bit more on policy. So, from the policy perspective, we know that Canadians overwhelmingly support the border restrictions continuing, and we're going to be with this pandemic for a long time. The virus counts, I don't see them magically coming down anytime soon, and we all know how long a vaccine can take. So we're really at the point where we have both Canada and the United States, but especially Canada, has been using a pretty blunt tool to deal with the pandemic from a cross-border perspective. A 14-day quarantine that's essentially mandatory for the vast majority of people. Obviously, there's some exceptions. And then a very, very restricted border. Well, that was probably really smart at the beginning of this pandemic, but we can't continue to operate that way. And I'm not going to argue that we need to ease these restrictions as the virus counts stay where they are, but we need to really start planning for them. And when I say planning, I don't just mean, developing sort of principles for easing the restrictions, but actually looking at the fact that our border policies have to fundamentally change, because health information is now and will for the foreseeable future be a part of the border processing experience. And so, right now there's a number of coalitions and groups that Chris and I are also involved in the Woodrow Wilson Center that's really trying to develop what that policy agenda looks like, trying to put together some pilot projects. You've probably seen recently there's one out of Alberta that reduces the mandatory quarantine for returning Canadians. So these things are very slowly happening, and they really have been inhibited by the fact that we're dealing with a whole new set of agencies that had traditionally not necessarily been in contact, like the CDC and the Public Health Agency of Canada. There's sort of a whole new processing environment. But we've also been really inhibited by the hollowing out of some of our key bilateral or institutions that engage in bilateral diplomacy, like the State Department, and especially the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, the US doesn't even have an ambassador to Canada right now. We have an acting person in that role. So that's really an inhibited, I think, moving forward from what has to become a new policy framework. And if it's not done collaboratively between the US and Canada, we're going to end up with 2 different systems or 2 different apps or 2 different testing protocols, and it's going to really thicken the border. And if we've learned anything from the experience of 9/11, it's that we don't want to wait 10 years to start figuring out how to do this together, right? We have the expertise in place. We have a lot we can leverage that was developed from the Beyond the Border Accord that can be pushed forward. It's really having the energy and the institutional guidance that can usher that along. So I do think if there is a Biden presidency, that the sort of repopulating of some of those key institutions will help in that bilateral push forward. And then getting back a little bit to the identity piece too, I was really sort of relieved to hear Jeremy say that there is a Cascadia identity, because I've been involved in something called the Cascadia Innovation Corridor effort that was created back in 2016. That is really a goal to better integrate the economies, but also the communities all the way from Portland, Oregon up to Vancouver, BC. And really the heart of that, I mean, it gets at transportation, it gets at economics. It's really driven largely by the tech sectors in Vancouver and Seattle. But the heart of it is that we share some common identity and common values, and really some common core political beliefs as well. And lately I've been a little sheepish in saying that, because I feel like as an American, it's maybe easy for me to say that cross-border identity exists. And I know it's a little bit different now in British Columbia, but I think some of it is still there. And part of one of the questions you had asked about, are these continued restrictions, do they sort of erode at that neighborliness? I think absolutely they do. I mean, we've seen American cars or cars that have American license plates up in BC getting kind of vandalized, and harassed. And I mean, I never dreamt that I would see that sort of pushback, and that just sort of points to how heightened everybody's kind of fears are right now around COVID and the border restrictions. Really sort of creating an us versus them. And some of that is understandable, but we need to move beyond that if we're going to actually move forward.
That framework of a collaborative new border policy is so useful because it cues us into thinking about the enormous unspooling consequences of this disaster that can't be addressed through patchwork local changes. And I'm so glad you brought up the question of health data, right? What does it mean to be disclosing as a regular practice health data at the border? And not when you're entering as an immigrant who plans to stay, but simply as a visitor. And what are the privacy and the ethical concerns? How does that information get gathered? How does it get collated? Who has access to it? These are such key questions that will have such consequences for so long into our future. Jeremy, what do you have to say? What's on your mind about these border issues?
I think what Lori was saying is very interesting about health data exchange and some of the procedural things. But look, I think we need a reality check here. There is no chance of this border opening or of quarantine being reduced or any of these things until the data shows that the threat of contagion from people from the United States is not so excessively larger than the threat of contagion of people in Toronto from people in Toronto. I mean, that's just a fact. And the public opinion on that is very, very emphatic, okay? I've seldom seen numbers reflecting as great a consensus in Canada. Secondly, there's something else going on, and it's uncomfortable to talk about, but I'm gonna tell you. The view of the United States as a society has deteriorated among Canadians, I would say, drastically. If you look at the numbers of recent polls, it's extraordinary. Now, partly that's because of the enormous antipathy also to Donald Trump, not his policies, but his character. Let me say, and it's not because we're more virtuous, but Donald Trump could not be elected to anything in Canada. I know Rob Ford was, but it's a little different. So this puts some constraints on the kind of anticipated cooperation that Lori was describing. The border stuff we did after 9/11 was a desperate attempt to get the American security establishment and the kind of monomaniacally focused Bush administration to accept that Canada was not a conduit for terrorism, and we would have done almost everything. Today, we're the ones that are seeking protection. I mean, there's an inversion here. So I just wanted to underline that's the realistic thing. I think Biden, and this, if he's elected, folks, he's elected. Okay, let's swallow that. If I think Biden, who is, if I may say, is rather Canadian in a lot of sort of basic instincts, just as a lot of Americans and Canadians have the same instincts. But the fact is, the turmoil in the United States is revealing the extent that there are so many Americans who don't. And I think Chris is right to validate those in terms of grievances, but it doesn't alter the reality. And Canadians are rather repelled by the evidence of what this implies in terms of choices. So anyway, I think that the border eventually will reopen, but it will never be what it was. When I grew up in Montreal, I skied in Vermont. People had cottages on Lake Champlain, and that's over. I can't tell you how many hundreds and hundreds of times doing TV and so on and so forth, I get the news that I'm not going to the United States anymore. I don't anticipate going to the United States anymore. I used to go to New York to see the Met. I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm sorry, that's rather elitist. Go somewhere bowling. Okay, whatever. People, it's really habits and behavior is being changed by the unfortunate evidence that the country's societies and their regard for inclusivity and the societies are diverging. I don't know how far that's going to go. I take Laurie's point. I don't see them diverging between where I live and where she lives. But otherwise I do. And that's a reality in Canada, and it's a policy reality. And what it does oblige us to do, apart from standing up for our interests, is to make sure that we are, in more respects than we are today, more self-sufficient. That is a policy imperative, and that includes on essential technologies. It includes a whole variety of things and practices. And I think it's what the next decade is going to be about.
I think this long-term framework is helpful for us in thinking about not just this kind of disastrous quarantine moment of the pandemic, but how attitudes and, as you're saying, Jeremy, customs are going to get changed, right? Are they changing now in ways that will be set going forward? Christopher, where are you with this? What are you thinking about this border moment?
Well, as Laurie suggested, she and I are involved in a number of things, taking a look at the border, and we're happy to talk about that sort of technical stuff. But from an economist's point of view, what you would expect when there are differences on two sides of a border is arbitrage. You know, that if say prices are higher on one side than the other, eventually people will go cross-border shopping until the prices kind of hit a nice equilibrium. And you can adjust for that a little bit, but that's what you would expect. If that's interrupted by border restrictions, there are some scenarios that we've been very worried about. Earlier in the pandemic, one of the things we worried about was a situation where COVID had put someone out of work. And because in the United States, healthcare is tied to employment, and they felt that they were without insurance and yet could have COVID, and they try to cross the border because Bernie Sanders tells them all the healthcare is free in Canada. Not quite true, but that could be the thing. And what happens with that individual who has an understandable and compassionate desire to cross the border, but shouldn't because they may in fact be infectious? Another scenario that we've started to think about in the context of the border is what happens if a vaccine, we're all very encouraged by Pfizer this week, but if there's a vaccine or treatment or even just a really good test that becomes available, it becomes available probably in the United States, a couple other countries, but the US has a limited capacity to make new vaccines. A lot of things about precursor drugs that we now get from China. And the Trump administration has been trying to figure out how do we ramp up production really, really fast, because if you can't get enough of this vaccine, you'll make some tough choices about how the economy comes back. But what happens if, as we saw with personal protective equipment and 3M early in the crisis, that there is a feeling that we're going to try to make sure that we produce vaccine for the United States first? I've been in a couple of meetings on this, and where Mexico, which has a pharmaceutical industry, is highly integrated with the US and with Europe because most of their manufacturers are American, European, or Asian. But Canada's pharmaceutical industry is largely a generic manufacturing industry, not an originators industry, does relatively less research, and significantly has really hostile relationships with other manufacturers, particularly the Pfizers and the Lillys of the world. So if there was a formula, would Canadians have access to it in a timely way? And if they did not have access to it in a timely way, then would it be Canadians who are trying to get across the border because they want the vaccine? Ideally, if you're a sensible person, you want to make sure those kind of cases that would drive people over the bend don't happen. And so we need to think about, as Prime Minister Trudeau has, what are the compassionate reasons that we might modify some of the definition of essential so that we could let some movement go back and forth and so forth. So that's a very important challenge for the two countries to work on together. Second point I would have about this, and that is COVID is attenuating the divide. And you and I talked about this at the beginning, the idea that there are some people who can work at home and telework, and there are some people who can't. What Jeremy's talking about being self-sufficient works if what you do is teach at a university or engage in diplomacy. But it doesn't work as well for people who are in manufacturing, people who work in agriculture, people who work in tourism. They need the border because the border is part of how we do things. And almost half of our Canada-US trade is now estimated to be intermediate goods, which is to say that Canada can't just make many of these things themselves. They make a piece of the thing, which is made North American-wide or even globally. So I'm not sure that the goal of autonomy or autarky works for Canada if for everybody in Canada. And for some, the border is still really important. And I think for those reasons, we have to find a way to make the border work for us, while obviously addressing the public health concerns and making sure people are safe. And then it gets me to the last thing, which is probably the reason that Canada should be most concerned about the border. And that is that thing we all obsess here in the United States about, which is money. Now, both our governments are spending well in excess of what we've taken in order to try to address the COVID crisis. And Canada entered the fourth quarter of 2019 was already a negative growth quarter for Canada. It has only gotten worse. The US has had relatively better economic performance since, in part because of partial opening, Canada relatively less. And also because the CERB has discouraged people from looking for work. It makes it easier to stay at home, at least for certain people. So Canada's spending more than it's taking in, has taken on an awful lot of debt, and is going to hit a fiscal wall. And it's unfair, but the United States often gets to go further into deficit because it has a reserve currency than Canada does. So what happens when the money runs out? We talked about federalism. The provinces are happy because they get the money they need when they ask for it from Ottawa. What happens when Ottawa can't pay anymore? What things are we going to stop paying for because we're run out of money? And if Canada doesn't have what you negotiated hard for with the USMCA, guaranteed market access to the US, you'll lose a major engine of economic growth that could help lift us both out of the jam that we're in. And so for me, that's why the border is so important. It's important for our future economy so that it creates the tax revenue so we can pay the deficits, but also keep the programs going. It's important for people whose jobs don't have the discretion of being autonomous in Canada. You need the rest of the world. And it's important, most of all, because arbitrage could set us into some very dangerous situations where people are trying to cross the border out of just a pure survival instinct, but end up making the pandemic worse. So for a lot of reasons, what Lori's doing, I think is absolutely great, and Western Washington is terrific to do it. What you have always done in Cascadia, or they have always done in Cascadia, a much more neighborly approach to the border, is something I agree with Jeremy and with Lori on this, has to be spread border-wide if we can manage it.
Can I make a comment, Alexandra, about?
And I should just tell you, we're coming, just before we leap into that, Jeremy, we're coming to the end of our time. So if you want to make a quick comment, and then if anyone else has a comment you'd like to make as a kind of wrap up, just warning you, we're coming to the end of our time. So Jeremy, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, just a couple of points. First of all, I wasn't arguing that Canada can be self-sufficient as an autarkic economy. I'm saying that this pandemic showed we had supply chain vulnerabilities and dependencies that we shouldn't have. And in some areas of technology, we have been too prone to accept our situation of being only a receiver. And so there's a lot of developmental stuff. But the 2 points I want to underline. One is that on vaccine. I mean, the last thing we want is vaccine nationalism. And that, unfortunately, is going on. Canada has joined with European countries, and I might say China. The United States is staying out about the need to address the global situation that Christopher brought up in his first intervention, and I agreed with what he said. But you know, those vulnerabilities of poor countries, it's not because of COVID. They've simply exposed their structural vulnerabilities, which we've been too indifferent to address. Another global problem we got to deal with. On the border, the thing is, we cannot generalize the situation at every point of the border. Different states are in different stages of contagion, of confusion. And so, you know, this thing has to settle. Of course, the border is going to be returned to normal, but it's going to follow the metrics of COVID. And that's the point I wanted to underline. Thanks.
Oh, good. Thanks, Jeremy. Lori, any closing comment from you?
Ooh, so much to say. It's a little
I know there's so little to cover. You should, yeah.
Maybe I'll just circle back to the beginning of sort of this last question and about the Canadian sort of pushback and reaction to what's been happening in the United States. And look, I mean, as an American, I feel it and I see it myself, and it's not pretty. But I don't think we can take that ideological impression and necessarily impose it, you know, blanketly on the border, because again, you know, some of us can be ideological in our shopping habits or in our business relations, but for the average Canadian who's used to coming down and saving a lot of money by going to Costco and buying milk or filling up on gas, I mean, that's the question that's interesting to me, because the border restrictions, you know, they're in place long enough now that we're absolutely going to see changes in consumer behavior, and that's going to affect communities and economies like the county where I live, which is right on the border. But whether or not that ideological sort of perspective will impact the border beyond COVID remains to be seen. And I'll just tell you one little anecdote that we found very interesting in our region. We were at the border in 2018 with a bunch of students up there doing surveys, and we do these surveys every few years, and we ask people where they're from and why they're crossing. And we happened to be doing it on a week in July in 2018, right after the tariffs and the counter tariffs were put in place, and there was some tension, and our students got a lot of Canadians that were sort of just spewing, you know, this anger at what the U.S. Was putting them in terms of this trade situation. And on the one hand, you know, they were saying how angry they were at the United States and the Trump administration, and how they didn't want to be coming to the US anymore to be shopping, but they were at the border crossing to shop. So there's ideology, and then there's sort of the reality of economics. And it remains to be seen how these border communities will be impacted by that, because we have so many issues to find our way out of right now.
Christopher, a brief closing comment from you.
I think this is a really wonderful topic to talk about, and I think we need to talk about it some more. Not saying I want extra time. I'd like to have extra time, but no, I think that one of the things about Canada-U.S. relations over the years is that it's always been a friendship between the peoples of Canada and the United States, who really like one another, even though we sometimes don't like each other's leaders or those sorts of things. And I think the most important challenge for us coming out of this is repairing those ties. And in a globalized world, I mean, for a long time, Canada was the only country that could have that kind of intimate, close relationship with the United States. And now, you know, many countries are competing for attention and connection. And while we certainly hope that Canada-US relations gets off to a good start with the next administration, there's lots of bilateral stuff to work on. I think the most important thing we could work on is that sense of empathy, to use Jeremy's term, for each other, and get to know each other, and view one another as people struggling to solve problems, and not necessarily, you know, better, worse, just everybody's trying. I think in so many areas of public policy, and your members, the members of the IPAC will know, there's so much you can learn from what a state is doing on a recycling program, or handling wastewater, or addressing climate change. We do collaborate all the time, and that's something we need to do more of. On my side of the border, I think the challenge is always to know Canada better, because we often don't. We have a lot of goodwill, but not a lot of detail. But we really need to work on that, because it's these ties that make our collaboration on so many things better. And if anything, this crisis to me underscores is the need for that kind of collaboration, but it requires knowledge and it requires exchange. And so you've started us really well here, and I know we didn't answer everything, but if anybody wants to keep this conversation going, Google me, just send a message. I'm happy to stay in touch.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists, to Lori Troutman and Christopher Sands and Jeremy Kinlan. You have given us so much to think about. Thank you for your astute insights and for your time. And we're grateful as well to IPAC's Zach Spicer and Aaron Bellwood, who put this event together with such professionalism and skill. And finally, thank you to the IPAC membership for having us here with you. It's been a real pleasure to be part of your annual conference. Thank you for including us. We wish you well, stay safe, and thank you so much to everyone.